What was TSR's first published science fiction role-playing game? The answer may not be what you think, and we're going to talk about that today on Daddy Rolled a One. Please help support Daddy Rolled a One by visiting my shop to buy a t-shirt, hoodie, mug, poster, tote bag, or notebook. I have a bunch of new designs, including the new D10 and D12 patent designs to join the patent designs for the D4, D8, and D20 that I already had. So please head over to the shop. There's a link in the show notes below, and thank you so much for your support. Hello there, and welcome back. I'm Martin. This is another video in my series on the history of early tabletop role-playing games, including Dungeons & Dragons. However, today we're not going to be talking about Dungeons & Dragons. We're going to be talking about some other very early games that were published by TSR, the company that ended up publishing Dungeons & Dragons in the 1970s and 80s, all the way up until the takeover by Wizards of the Coast in 1997. So a lot of times you'll hear people talking about how this game here, Metamorphosis Alpha, is the first. Some people say it's the first science fiction role-playing game. However, we know that Starfaring was published a little bit before this game. So we have talked about that before. And also, although this says fantastic role-playing game of science fiction adventures, as I've mentioned before when I covered this, I talked about it a little bit when I ended up doing my video as a tribute to James Ward, who was the author of this book. You see right here. But right after James Ward passed away, I did an homage or a tribute to him, and I talked about this game. So I like this game. I don't consider it science fiction. It's more science fantasy. I know it might sound like a nitpick or that I'm, splitting hairs here. Science fantasy is related to science fiction. However, I think that it's different enough in this case to call this a science fantasy game. And so I don't include it as like the first science fiction game published by TSR. Another thing that I think is really interesting here, I'm just going to point it out once again. This is published in 1976, and it says on the cover, fantastic role-playing game of science fiction adventures. So just keep that in mind as we kind of talk about this, and we're going to get to that in a minute and why I pointed that out. Okay, now this game comes out in 1978, and it says it's a science fantasy role-playing game. So this is sort of a spiritual successor to Metamorphosis Alpha. And again, I covered this one in my tribute to James Ward. Again, because he is the author of this particular game here. Okay, so I wouldn't consider this science fiction, and in fact, they go out of their way to say it's science fantasy. So then usually what happens is people say that the first science fiction role-playing game published by TSR is this one, Star Frontiers. My box is beat up here. Now, this is not my original. I didn't have this game growing up. I played this game. My friends had it. I acquired this off eBay a number of years ago, which I guess maybe goes to show why the box is in such bad shape, because you've seen from most of my other ones that, I tend to take pretty good care of my stuff. But this is published in 1982. Science fiction role-playing game Star Frontiers. So a lot of people will say, well, this is the first science fiction role-playing game published by TSR. However, I'm going to disagree with that as well. And so we're going to talk about that. But what we need to do first is talk a little bit about these early games that were being published by TSR, how they described them, how they saw them, and how those types of games, while they didn't necessarily use the term role-playing game, they were all related. And even D&D itself doesn't call itself a role-playing game until years and years later. So in that case, I think it behooves us to look at these other games that were being published around the same time, even earlier than this. This is 1976, D&D is 1974. But in that in-between period in 74 and 75, we have some other games published that I think might qualify as being the first role-playing game by TSR. So we're going to go over to my laptop now, my computer, and go look at some PDFs of some early games because I don't own them as physical copies. I was originally going to look at this on my laptop as a PDF, but I do have the physical copy of this book, so I thought it might be more fun to read it this way, since it's just fun to look at old books like this versus something on a screen. So again, this is book 1, Men and Magic. of the 3-volume set for original Dungeons & Dragons. And again, you see here, I know I mentioned this a lot, but I always do this in case this is someone's first time watching my channel. It says Dungeons & Dragons Rules for Fantastic Medieval War Games Campaigns. Doesn't say role-playing. Okay, this is for role-playing, this is for Fantastic Medieval War Games Campaigns. Now, if you look inside here, down here, it basically says, while it is possible to play a single game unrelated to any other game events, past or future, it is the campaign for which these rules are designed. It is relatively simple to set up a fantasy campaign, and better still, it will cost almost nothing. In fact, you will not even need miniature figures, although their occasional employment is recommended for real spectacle when battles are fought. A quick glance at the equipment section of this book will reveal just how little is required. So it goes on to talk about it. You mostly need time, and that the referee is going to have to set things up. It talks about the longevity of existing campaigns, notably Blackmoor in the Twin Cities and Greyhawk and Lake Geneva. And the demand for these rules from people outside these campaigns point towards a fantastic future. Then it says these rules are strictly fantasy, and talks about some of the influences of the game. So again, I don't know that Gary necessarily does a great job of explaining exactly what this game is if you haven't played a similar type of game before. But what he keeps coming back to describing this is a way to play campaigns. And he's going to say it again on this page in the introduction. And he says that they cover the major aspects of fantasy campaigns but still remain flexible. As with any other set of miniature rules, they are guidelines to follow in designing your own fantastic medieval campaign. So he does call them miniature rules. He says, as with any other set of miniature rules, even after he just said you don't actually need miniatures. And then he goes on to describe a little bit more here, how you can add new rules and take out things that don't work and that kind of thing. And then he says if you're a player purchasing these rules to improve your situation in an existing campaign, you will find that there's a great advantage to knowing what is herein. And then it tells you what's all in the different 3 books, the 3 different volumes. And then up here in scope, he talks about the equipage listed in the following section. Dungeons and Dragons is basically complete. Nearly endless campaigns of all levels of fantastic medieval war game play. And then he says the scope doesn't actually need to be restricted to medieval. You can go from the prehistoric to the future, but he recommends exploring the medieval basically thoroughly first before you decide to branch out. And then he says the use of paper, pencil, and map boards are standard. Miniature figures can be added if the players have them available and so desire, but miniatures are not required, only aesthetically pleasing. Similarly, unit counters can be employed with or without figures, although by themselves the bits of cardboard lack the eye appeal of the varied and brightly painted miniature figures. So again, he is saying you don't need miniatures, although it sounds like he's kind of recommending that they would look good at the table and that players might want to use them. He talks about unit counters, and we know that TSR starts partnering with different companies very, very quickly to start having those companies produce, quote unquote, official Dungeons and Dragons miniature figures. So they clearly saw that there was money to be made there, at least at the time. So I think the reason I wanted to read that is to make sure that people were aware of how this game was introduced, what it was explained that it is. And the short version is right here on the cover. It's rules for fantastic medieval war games campaigns. The reason I keep harping on this is going to be evident in just a second when we start talking about some other games that TSR produces in the early 1970s. Okay, so what I want to talk about just really briefly again are some other games that were published by TSR around the same time, and look at how they define themselves. So I'm going to start with Boot Hill. This is published in 1975. I talked about this in my video on the 4, role-playing games that were published in the year 1975. So a year after Dungeons & Dragons is published in 1974. So I'll put a link to that video up here and you can learn more about Boot Hill there. But Boot Hill is considered a role-playing game. It is considered it's in contention for being the second role-playing game published by TSR. Again, watch that other video and I'll explain kind of the controversy over that. But regardless, it is called a role-playing game. However, let's look at what we talk about here in our definitions. Rules for Wild West gunfights and campaigns with miniature figures on a man-to-man scale. So this one is specifically telling you that you need miniature figures. And, Dungeons and Dragons says that as well, but then in the introduction, Gary says you don't really need miniature figures. But again, they're talking about campaigns. So Dungeons and Dragons says fantastic medieval war games campaigns. This says Wild West gunfights and campaigns. So that's how it's defined here. And then if we get into the inside, and again, I don't want to read this whole thing because I did go over in that other video, but if you look at the way that they describe this game, it talks about rules being aimed at enjoyment on a plane, unusual to wargaming, the individual and personal. So while it's a campaign, they're talking about having an individual character. You see, they even put the character here in quotes. Now, we know Dave Arneson played Boot Hill, and he had an ongoing character, El Pancho, which was a reference to Pancho Villa. But they played this game at the time as a role-playing game. With role-playing elements, just like Blackmoor, just like Braunstein, just like Brownstone, just like Greyhawk, one of the games that it precedes Dungeons and Dragons. So why am I bringing this up? It's because if you're going to say that Boot Hill is a role-playing game, based on the way that this is described, then it means that there's other games that aren't called role-playing games, but probably should be. And it's important to understand how the players themselves saw these games taking place and how they played them. So it goes through here and it talks a little bit more about, in addition to the singular campaign type of play, there are 2 scenarios included, and it goes through that. So you see here, you've got your rules for your turn sequence and movement and weapons and combat and brawls. And then it talks about campaigns, campaign game suggestions and posses and tracking and aging. Now, there are some other games that come out from TSR sort of around the same time. And I'm not necessarily going in chronological order. All these games are going to come out in either 1974 or 1975. So this is Warriors of Mars. This is one that gets overlooked a lot. I did briefly mention this just recently because this is one of the games. Part of the reason it gets forgotten is because it was pulled so quickly, because TSR puts this out and they use the word Barsoom, says Warfare of Barsoom in miniature. And the idea of this game is obviously it's based on Edgar Rice Burroughs and the John Carter of Mars series. And they tell you that straight up inside. We're going to see that in just a second. But in talking about it, they never got the rights. So very common from TSR at the time. They just kind of I guess the idea was we're going to, just, what's the phrase? You do it first and ask for permission later, just get it out there. And so they got it out there, but it was pulled down very, very quickly. So there are not that many copies of this out in the wild. So what I saw was that one of the box sets it's not a box set, it's a book. One of the booklets, this booklet here, same size as those original little brown books from from original Dungeons and Dragons. So one of these books sold in 2021, and it was in really good shape, but 2021 sold for a little over $2,000. I literally just saw one at 2 weeks ago for sale from some auction house, $10,000. So that's just how crazy the market for these older products has gotten. So at that rate, I'm never going to have this as print. I mean, even at $2,000, I wouldn't do that. That's a frivolous expense that I can't afford right now. But I do have a PDF copy here. So it says the Warfare of Barsoom in miniature, rules for individual and large-scale land and aerial conflict. Okay, so let's go in and look at the inside here in the foreword. This foreword's by Gary Gygax. It says, worlds of heroic fantasy are many, but perhaps the best known of them all is the Barsoom of Edgar Rice Burroughs. I'm not sure that's true, but okay. Where John Carter, Tars Tarkas, Deja Thoris, et al. Adventure endlessly in eternal youth. These rules are an attempt to expand beyond your vicarious enjoyment of this Martian world. While there are but 11 books in the entire series, there is a limitless new realm of possibility awaiting herein. The essence of Barsoom, the fearless warriors, the men, the monstrous animals, the geography of Burroughs' Mars, the social customs, the weaponry have been formalized into rules which permit the creation of whole new sagas. The tale can be as simple or as a minor skirmish between two swordsmen, or it can be as complex as the interactions which arise between several of the Barsoomian city empires. It can be the lone adventures of a hero pitted against the harsh realities of a Martian wilderness, or it can be the epic tale of a voyage of discovery aboard a small, let's say a small flyer, aboard small flyer. Of course, there's a slight hitch. Edgar Rice Burroughs did not create Barsoom without labor, forethought, planning, and plain hard work. So to the varying degree, that's going to come to you if you're going to play this game. So it's axiomatical that one gets as much out of something as one puts into it. As war games are interpersonal affairs, there is also to be considered the corollary about the chain being as strong as its weakest link. So he goes on to talk about this in here, and it says it gives the readers multiple levels of play. There's episodic games, whether based on large battles or individual combats or adventures, that can be devised and completed without undue effort or the requirement of lengthy play. Related episodes can be attained simply by devising the background upon which to play them. Campaigns requiring a referee and several participants are generally left to the imaginations of those concerned, remembering that the laws which will govern all are clearly delineated herein. The rules have to be kept to a minimum, the barest necessities required for consistency and clarity. We believe that those who use them will be amply capable of whatever expansion and augmentation they require to make their Barsoom an enjoyable place in which to stage their adventure. So again, he's talking about having a referee and having these ongoing games where you have, it doesn't use the word character necessarily, but it talks about like playing from game to game and again, creating a campaign with a referee. So role-playing elements in here. So it's hard to say, and I did talk about this a little bit earlier before, where there's a nuance between saying that something has role-playing elements and then calling it a role-playing game. It's the rules it's the rules for how to role-play that make it a role-playing game. So these games don't necessarily have that yet, but they're kind of getting there. And that's the part that Gary Gygax was very interested in. He was interested in the game aspect. Dave Arneson was interested in the role play aspect. Now that's a very simplistic explanation. It also doesn't mean to imply that Dave Arneson was not interested in playing games. He was. He has a war game background, a miniatures background, board game background. He was good at rules. He wrote rules for games. So that's not to say that he's not a rules guy. It's just that he was, once you get into the Blackmore parts that he's responsible for creating, from what I understand from people that knew him, is that he was more interested in how to add more role-playing elements. And what Gary Gygax is kind of known for is being the guy that says, hey, we can have a rule for that. So that's not my words. Those are people that knew him that said that. So I think it makes sense that these don't necessarily get to the point where they're creating rules for role play, but they do have role play elements. And my point is, if you're going to call Boot Hill a role playing game, then I think that you're going to start to maybe think about, should we also call Warriors of Mars a role playing game? Now, nobody really says that too much, but I think that there's something there. I think that there's something that could be, looked at in that context. So just another kind of cool thing here that has nothing to do with the game rules, but the illustrations in this are by Greg Bell. So Greg Bell was probably most famous, I guess, for designing the Lizard Man logo for TSR Hobbies Inc. So that little Lizard Man guy we've seen before. So at this point, they're still using the G and the K for Gary Gygax and Don Kay from Tactical Studies Rules, because this is published in 1974, before the foundation or the formation of TSR Hobbies Inc. And again, just as a reminder, they're not the same company. Tactical Studies Rules had to dissolve after Gary, it didn't have to, but it did. It dissolved after Don Kay died. And they bought out his wife's shares, and Brian Bloom, who was one of the three founders of Tactical Studies Rules, along with Gary Gygax and Don Kay. He was really the money guy. But he brought his father on, and his father brought in money to buy out Don Kay's widow, and they dissolved Tactical Studies Rules and created a new company, TSR Hobbies. So if you're ever confused by that, the TSR and TSR Hobbies technically doesn't stand for anything. It's just letters. So it's obviously an homage to Tactical Studies Rules, but at that point, once Tactical Studies Rules is dissolved, there is no more. The TSR no longer stands for that. I know it sounds confusing. If it is, leave me a comment. I'll try to explain it better. All right, but so we go through here. So I just wanted to kind of show a few of the just parts of the book, see some of the cool drawings by Greg Bell, and talking about land warfare. There's characters in here. John Carter as Tars Tarkas. Again, all these things. So you're getting these individual levels of personalities, they call them, but characters. That's what they are. So, again, this game was sort of, I don't want to say it was a flash in the pan. It's just, it didn't get the chance to kind of expand because of the copyright infringement. So, and or trademark infringement or both, whatever you want to say. Some cool maps here. And a warship, which is really cool. So, I mean, I think these drawings are kind of neat. Maybe from a technical standpoint, maybe they're not as technically proficient as drawings, but I think they maybe have a little more character to them than some of the modern stuff that I've been seeing. So, but art is subjective. So that's just me. I'm sure a lot of people look at this and think that it's not well executed, but again, I think it has a lot of character. So that's Warriors of Mars. Now, the main one that I really want to talk about here is going to be this game, Star Probe, 1975. And this is written by John M. Snyder. Now, John was a member of the Blackmore Bunch. He is part of Dave Arneson's group. He played in the Blackmore games. At a certain point, again, he runs Blackmore games. And we're going to see that Blackmore connection right here in the introduction or the foreword. Maybe it's the foreword. But this is a game of adventure, conflict, and exploration in space. Published by TSR Games. Now, see, we've moved. We're no longer tactical studies rules. And this is that Lizard Man logo I was talking about, which was illustrated by Greg Bell. Now, the price is $6, so it's different. These are all $5. This one was $5. If you see at the very beginning here, $5, as was Boot Hill, is $5. This is $6. I think the reason that this was $6 was because in addition to this book, and this is the same size as those other ones, it's that small size rule book. This also came with a map and some counters and like a little Ziploc bag, from what I understand. So I've never seen this in the wild. So I think maybe that's where that extra dollar went, was for the map and the counters. So we see here, again, by John Snyder, and then illustrated by Paul Snyder. That's John's brother. John has a couple of brothers who are involved in gaming. The other one, the third that I know of, I don't know if there's more than this, but the third one that I know of is Richard Snyder. So Richard is, I believe, unfortunately passed away. I know John is still alive, or was, as of very, very recently, and I'm not sure about Paul. So in the foreword, now this is written by Gary Gygax, September of 1974. And so it says, he says, games, but first he spells forward incorrectly, uses the wrong version of the word. Games based on the projected future are perforce fanciful, but Star Probe seems to operate on far more realistic precepts. This does not imply that there is a lack of imagination in its concept. Rather, playing the game brings one to the point where he almost believes that it could happen this way. Star Probe is basically a parallel contest where the participants, representing separate empires, seek to explore and exploit new star systems for the glory of their governments and the enrichment of their bank accounts. Interstellar colonialism indeed. During the course of a game, these contestants will seldom run afoul of each other, which is well and good, for the likelihood of fearsome life forms and hostile natives inhabiting the discovered planetary systems is all too great. So each player will probably find himself embroiled in a surface battle or an engagement in outer space before many game months have elapsed. The victor is that player who manages to gain the most from his explorations while losing the least during the allotted five game years, 60 strategic turns each of one game month. So that's where the 60. So it's the game is intended to last for 5 years, with each turn representing 1 month. So 5 times 12, 60. In fact, the game can be shortened a bit or extended infinitely as suits the participants. It can be played solo or by 8 separate players, although more can play by assuming subordinate roles or by acting as the discovered life forms.
And then it talks about the star map that has over 2,000 star systems on it, which is pretty cool. And we're going to see that at the end here. And then it says, assuming starting positions are decided by some random method, a given participant will have to play many dozens of games before he becomes really conversant with the sector represented by the map. In fact, if the games played are not connected, but each is considered a separate contest in itself, there will be endless variety available, for the same star system can yield hundreds of different exploration results, so each time the player visits the system, it can prove to be novel. I'm reading this whole thing because I just want you guys to understand why I'm talking about this game this way. Star Probe, however, is more than just another interesting space game. It is the first part of a trilogy of games/rules. It is the introductory and provides practice and the groundwork for those who desire to enlarge the former into a vast stellar empire game. And we believe that most of you will. The successive volumes will enable players to design their own ships, detail adventures with strange beasts and unknown intelligent civilizations, explore the ruins of vanished empires, and engage in cosmic confrontations which involve whole fleets of warships. If this prospect does not appeal to you, then there is nothing lost, for this game alone will provide all the variety needed to maintain continual challenge. For those readers who are excited by the larger perspective offered, we suggest that you become thoroughly familiar with Star Probe now, so that the other aspects of the campaign can be added as quickly as possible. Either way, you can't lose. And then he goes on to talk about John Snyder, who is a resident of the Twin Cities and a member of the large and active group of wargamers there. This group, the Midwest Military Simulation Association, we've talked about them before, the MMSA, did much in the testing and refinement of the author's work. As of this writing, they are still engaged in a campaign, currently in the stage of imperial expansion, with one lost vessel from an avian race having had the misfortune of somehow arriving at the world of Blackmoor and promptly losing all to an angry wizard whom they foolishly disturbed. Although John is interested primarily in space wargaming, he somehow manages to become involved with the other campaigns and battles which the MMSA maintains in perpetuity. Despite his bent for mathematics, we managed to convince him that his game should be linguistically and mathematically simplified so we all could enjoy it. You will. So Gary Gygax in his typical Gygaxian prose. So there's some interesting things that he says there at the end, and I'm not quite sure if he meant this as like a slight dig or if, just comes across that way. But when he talks about like, having to tell John to like change the game so it was easier to understand, to me, it sounds a little like it's a dig, but I'm not sure. I'm not sure. Maybe they, that was just how they talk to each other. So I don't want to put too much into that. But what I think is the most interesting part in that paragraph, that last one, is talking about how there are people that were playing Star Probe and that their, vessel, for lack of a better word, or full of their, let's say, characters, quote unquote, end up in Blackmoor. Well, Blackmoor, we know, was a role-playing exercise. So if you could take characters from this game and put them into Blackmoor, which was a role-playing, we'll call it a role-playing game, then that would mean that this game has to have role-playing elements in order for that to make sense. And so that's why I've seen people say that this game, Star Probe, should be categorized as a role-playing game because the people who played it did so with role-playing elements. So one of the things that I know is that I met and got a chance to talk with Dave McGarry when I was at DaveCon. So Dave McGarry, probably most famous, known as the person who designed the board game Dungeon with the exclamation point. And so a lot of you, if you're my age, probably grew up having played that game. So I actually didn't. I did not play Dungeon. None of my friends had it. I didn't get it. I was really focused on the role-playing games. So I didn't get Dungeon, but later on, I met friends, like after I moved a few times, and I talked to them, and it turns out they played Dungeon when they were kids. So most recently last year at a holiday party that my gaming group, I call them my gaming group. It's one of my gaming groups that I met back in the late 90s. They have a holiday party every year where everybody comes and now everybody's got kids, and they have their old game of Dungeon from like the 70s. I think it came out in 75 or 76, something like that. And they dug it out of the garage, and all the kids who were there, who are like roughly my daughter's age, say she's 14, she's almost 15, but she was there. And then there were people as young as maybe say like 10, maybe 9, 10. And there were people as old as like say 18, 19, but all of them got together in this giant game of Dungeon. And, you know, they shared characters because I think it only plays up to 6, but it was really fun watching them do that. And I thought that was really neat. So I got to meet Dave McGarry and talk to him about his role in, you know, not just that game. And it was really funny how he asked me, like when I met him, I said, hey, you know, I just caught him in the hallway unawares. And I said, he was on his way to go, you know, be available for interviews, I think was what he was really doing. And I said, hey, since I bumped into you, would you mind if I chatted with you a little bit? And he said, yeah, am I one of the people he said, am I the person responsible for you being here? Like, you know, for a lifetime of role playing. And I was like, you're one of them. Absolutely. So it was just a really funny way. And he was wearing his trademark hat, and I got a chance to chat with him. And wish I'd taken some pictures, but I was more interested in just kind of being present in the moment. But in talking with him, one of the things that came up was I mentioned how I knew that he had played Star Probe. And he was like, yes, absolutely. I played Star Probe, Star Empires. And he told me this really interesting story. And I was furiously scribbling notes when he told me. And I looked back at my notes when I was getting ready for this video. And unfortunately, I didn't do what I should have done, which is on the plane on the way home from the convention. I should have transcribed my notes while it was still fresh, and I didn't. And that was over 2 months ago. And I really can't read the majority of my scribbles. The gist of what I could get out of it was that Dave McGarry was playing in a game with John Snyder, and it seemed to be they were playing like one-on-one. And I think a lot of these games were played that way. Like John would be the referee and he'd play with one player, and they were all part of a bigger campaign, but they could play separately because they were all basically running a ship. So think of Star Probe as like you have your, you know, version of like, let's say it's the Enterprise or whatever ship you want from Star Trek, you know, whatever. And you're exploring the galaxy and you're trying to find these new civilizations and find out as much information as you can about them and then bring it back to your home base, with the understanding that ideally what you're trying to do is then eventually you'd want to settle that area and you know, put population there and live in those areas. But the first step is you have to explore and see if it's open for that kind of thing. And so what Dave McGarry told me was that he was exploring a planet and he went onto a planet of robots. And so he landed there and he decided he had a character that could shape change. And so he decided to shape change into, he said a rock, or at least that's what my writing looks like, he said. And John Snyder ruled that he turned into a single-celled atom. But that was huge. And then Dave McGarry talks about how like he made some rolls. And what I wrote down in my notes was 5 times 6 on D6. So I think what I was trying to make a note of, and again, he was talking so fast, I didn't want to stop him. I think what he said, if I remember correctly, it was that he rolled 5 6s in a row on D6. And so because of that, his atom-sized rock just expanded into this. It was massive, according to the rules of this game. And it ended up like completely affecting and changing the way that this space campaign was being run. And then he talked about that's how you ended up with, and I think he said the Megariad, you know, after his last name, but essentially this whole area of space that he ends up colonizing by having one guy try to shape change into a rock and then making these incredible, statistically highly unlikely die rolls that John Snyder ruled meant that he became this, like, you know, huge thing. So, again, I wish that I had a little bit more detail there, but I asked him about that and I said, oh, like, you know, did you continue playing that character? And he's like, yes, like that's what we did. We played the same character time after time, every time that we played with John. And so, you know, time would move on. Other players would come in, they would do things and we'd have to react to that because it wasn't cooperative. It wasn't a cooperative role-playing game, but there were role-playing elements because they were making decisions in the in kind of like the context of what they thought this character would do because they were assuming the role of that person. And so again, with that and these ongoing campaigns and having these role-playing elements, this technically then qualifies as a role-playing game. And again, I'm going to say it for like the fourth time, but I just want to reiterate. If you're going to call Boot Hill a role-playing game based on the way that it's described, I think you have to call Star Probe a role-playing game. So here's some of the cool things that are in here. So it's very turn-based. It's very procedural. It's only like 36 pages versus its sequel, Star Empires, which is going to be much longer, like almost twice as long, I think. Not quite, but pretty close. So it goes through all these different things. You have these, your star systems type exploration matrix. I'm not getting into the rules on this because, again, my point is just discuss its history. But you see all your different species that you can have: amoeboid, plant, insect, feline, canine, humanoid, ursoid, avian, mammalian, reptilian, ichthyoid or amphibian, silicate-based, and then unknown classes, parentheses, strange. So it says the race that is unknown means there's no corresponding life form on your planet with which to compare it. For example, it could be based on gas, liquid, or some other solid besides carbon or silicon. The final characterization is not important in this game, but the idea is that when you find a planet, you roll to see if it's inhabited, and if it is inhabited, then you roll again to see what kind of inhabitants live there. And then you have your race versus race table when you interact with them. So this really reminds me a lot of the tables in the Advanced Dungeons & Dragons. I think it's either the Player's Handbook or the Dungeon Master's Guide. It might be both, the original versions, where it talks about how each race gets along with every other race and whether they tolerate them or hate them or there's goodwill towards them or that kind of thing. This reminded me of that a lot. It's, it's different in function, but it just reminded me of that. So you have all these different actions you can take when you land on a planet. But the idea here is, again, you win if you have amassed the most information about your planet that you've been looking at, or your system that you've been looking at, and then bringing it back to your home base. Now, if you'd say, well, winning conditions preclude this from being a role-playing game because role-playing games don't have winning conditions, I would, maybe, I don't want to say disagree. Well, yeah, I would disagree with that, because a lot of times in these early role-playing games, there were winning conditions as shown by tournament play. Dungeons & Dragons was played as tournament games for a huge part of the early years, where they had these different adventures. Many of the famous adventures, or modules, if you want to call them that we play as Dungeons & Dragons, were originally played as tournament adventures where players were scored based on certain actions that they took or didn't take in the game. And you'd have a team of players that could win, but you could also have an individual player that could win that might not even be on the winning team, but did everything the way that they were supposed to, or, got extra goodies. So I think that's interesting. And because of that, because you can have Dungeons & Dragons played with a scoring matrix to say that, yes, somebody won, then I think that you could have Star Probe played with a winning condition, and that doesn't preclude it from being a role-playing game. So there's more here in this. You see, there's the other things that were being offered at the time. This is that map we're talking about. Each one of these dots is a different planet, and based on the kind of shape, and it's really hard to see on here, but that means, it's what kind of sun is there. Is it a sun like ours? Is it a new sun, or is it a sun that's kind of on its way out? Like, is it super hot? Is it cooling? Or is it like ours? And then you have your little counters here. So all of this would have come in the little Ziploc bag that we talked about. Now, one of the other things I wanted to mention here, as far as when we're talking about role-playing games and how they're defined, people have different ideas of what this means. And so Gary Gygax even mentioned something kind of different when he talked about, the role-playing aspects of these games. So I'm going to go over that in just a minute. So I was reading a quote recently about Gary Gygax wrote. So this is from a magazine called Europa, a zine, Europa issue number 9, 1975. And so I first read about this on Reddit, and then I believe that it's discussed in the Elusive Shift, if I could remember that, but I just looked for it here. So The Elusive Shift by John Peterson. I should point that out. So the quote is that somebody had written in and talking about named George Phillies, and had written into the magazine noting that there are different types of games. So there's like board war games, there's miniature war games, and then there's the game Diplomacy. So that's kind of like the third kind of game, but that D&D, this person said D&D adds a fourth dimension in war games apart from those existing three, which is the feeling that one is actually the character represented in the game. So role playing. So that was sort of the premise of what this person, George Phillies, was talking about. And Gary Gygax writes back in issue number 9. And again, he disagrees. So he says, Phillies finds that the appeal of D&D might rest in its fulfillment of role-playing, that is, i.e., allowing participants to imagine themselves as some super powerful or just plain extraordinary character in a fantasy world. And then it says, for Gygax, the appeal of the game was based on something else, which was constant challenge, never-ending exercise, and problem solving. So I think that's very telling as far as how Gary Gygax approached this idea of what is Dungeons and Dragons. Now, he's going to lean into it later and call it a role-playing game because that was popular and it was selling. Okay. But as you know, here in 1975, so just a year after D&D's being published, he's saying that the appeal isn't, at least to him, the idea that you're taking on the role of your character. He's saying that it's the constant challenge. It's problem solving. And I think that once you know that, it starts to help explain this idea of like why he was constantly adding in these rules to explain things, because he was trying to create a framework for a dungeon master to create challenges for players, problems that needed to be solved, and then a framework of rules to help that dungeon master then make a ruling or adjudicate the decisions that the players come up with in order to solve that challenge or that problem. So that to him was what was exciting about this style of game. And he saw Dungeons and Dragons that way, which also then explains why these other early games have a lot of that in them. A lot of those early games like Boot Hill and Warriors of Mars and Star Probe all have these elements that are there to create challenges that need to be overcome by the players. And that is a very sort of board game / war game approach, miniature war game approach versus a board war game approach to this style of game. But I think it explains a lot as far as like how Gary saw these types of things. Now, he probably changed his mind later or you know, whatever the case may be, but at least at this point early on, he's describing it. And again, I point that out because it explains a lot of things like the scoring at tournaments. And we just talked about that. But what I think is interesting is that when you view it through that lens of how Gary seemed to see these games, I don't think that he necessarily saw Dungeons and Dragons as being different from Boot Hill and those other games that we just mentioned. I think he saw them all as this new sort of category of game, and they were all of that category, which is partly a way to play miniatures, war games, campaigns, whether the setting was fantastic medieval or whether the setting was Wild West or whether the setting was galactic conquest or whether the setting was Barsoomian Mars. I think that those games, the reason they're all kind of published around the same time and they have very similar approach is because they were all seen as sort of part of that category. So now with hindsight, we look back and we kind of tend to separate Dungeons and Dragons from those other games and say, well, Dungeons and Dragons is clearly a role-playing game and the others aren't. Now, if you look at the rules, there are definitely parts of D&D that don't exist in these other games. Probably the most significant one is that Dungeons and Dragons in the original game, the original 3 books, has rules for how to create an individual, unique character that has attributes and characteristics that would impact the way that you play that character, and has rules for how that character advances over time. So it's definitely it's a step beyond in terms of how it explains to do it. But the rest of the game pretty much is very similar to these other ones. And if the thought was that, again, if Boot Hill has rules for creating this individual character that you used in a gunfight, but you assumed the role and created a name for your character, and it wasn't just my guy shoots your guy, but El Pancho is going to challenge you to a duel, you're adding in those role-playing elements, and these other games did have that. Okay, so I think that explains my point of view on this. And now I'm going to next cover the second and the third part of the trilogy of games by John Snyder. So the second part, again, is going to be called Star Empires. And we're going to talk about that. And I actually have that as a physical copy. So I'm going to move off the laptop and we'll go back to discussing games like that, looking, on my credenza so you can see the book in person. And then the third part of the trilogy, again, is never going to be published, Star Master. And now I do understand that the folks at Secret of Blackmoor are wanting to publish it, and that they have, access to some of the early drafts, and that eventually that might be something that they do. I sure hope they do. I think it would be great. I'd love if they could republish the other parts as well, because they're very hard to come by now, that being Star Probe and Star Empires. But if that's something that's down the way, I think it would be cool to see. Again, in its historical context of what this game was like and how it would have been different from things that ended up coming out. All right, but that's going to be in the next part of the video, so make sure that you stay tuned for that.
Okay, now we're going to talk a little bit about Star Empires. And this is the second part of the planned trilogy of games by John Snyder. So we've already talked about Star Probe. Now, the third part of the trilogy is never going to be published by TSR. We'll talk about that as we kind of wrap up talking about this. This is 1977, so the same year Star Wars comes out. I know it's totally a coincidence because, as we saw in Star Probe, I think this was already written or very, very close to being written by the time Star Probe came out. So it's not published until 77, but they were already planning this trilogy of games. So this is going to be by, again, John Snyder, The Game of Galactic Conquest. And I'm going to go to the back really quick just for the credits, because the art this time is going to be different. So the art in here is by Dave Sutherland and David Nolte. And so it's, again, you see game design by John Snyder and then development by Richard Snyder, one of John's brothers, Greg Svensson, and Brian Bloom. And then editing by Gary Gygax and Brian Bloom, and then assistance by Tim Jones. We already talked about the art. So again, it's that kind of small-sized book that was typical at the time. Although by this time in 77, we've already seen the publication in 1976 of Metamorphosis Alpha. I showed that at the very beginning of the video. And that's a full, what we in America call like full size, letter size, whatever you want to call that size book. So they had already started publishing things like that. Empire the Petal Throne is another one that is fuller size in a box set. So, but they stuck with this smaller size for this particular game. So I got this just recently, actually. I found it for quite reasonably on eBay and picked it up. So I'm going to just go through the foreword really quickly. This is by Mike Carr. Talked about Mike many times here on the channel. I was fortunate enough to get to meet him at DaveCon back in April. So he says, ideas and concepts, those are the essence of science fiction, a look into the far future with expansive stellar empires, a variety of peoples and races, and a plethora of fantastic machines, as well as the uncertainty of the unknown. The elements of science fiction that account for its unusual and growing appeal are many and varied, but not undeniable. This booklet of science fiction gaming has all the above elements and more. Above all, it is a booklet of ideas and concepts for those who desire the ultimate in space gaming campaigns. As such, it is a special type of game. Think of it almost as a game kit, allowing you to put together the pieces you desire for a space campaign of your own. Using the inspirations and outlines herein, create your own stellar empires as you wish, with as much detail as you like. There is plenty to choose from. With the success of Star Probe and its considerable interest in its merit as a game, players have ever since been requesting a follow-up. No problem from the author's viewpoint, since John Snyder is a prolific writer who has already written the third volume of this series. The wealth of material he has produced shows a keen interest in and widespread knowledge of science fiction writings and concepts. Like its predecessor, Star Probe, Star Empires is not a game which is simply set up and played in a single sitting. It is, above all, a game campaign system which can be most effectively run by a referee and numerous players who may be exploring and acting independently of each other. Depending on the referee and his methods of moderating the game, the play can unfold in many ways and along many avenues. The possibilities are legion and yours to discover. That's written by Mike Carr, March of 1977. And then he says, the star map provided with Star Probe, or which can be purchased with this game, represents only a small portion of the galaxy. Feel free to expand it as you wish. So Mike is talking about a few things in here in this for that I think are very important. One is, again, this is a game intended for campaigns, long-term campaigns. He talks about the use of a referee, which, going all the way back to Bronstein, is sort of one of those hallmarks of separating games into different kind of categories. And once you add the referee, you're kind of starting to do something a little bit different. You need that neutral arbiter to help decide differences between players. And a referee, as we know, is a crucial element in a role-playing game. Now, just having a referee doesn't mean that you automatically have a role-playing game. We've talked about that, but it is, I think, one of the things that is necessary to have a role-playing game is to have that person who is well-versed in the rules and knows enough about the campaign setting to make rulings that are consistent for the players. Okay, so also he talks a lot about this. Basically, this is like a toolkit. There's these different, if you want to call them like, I can't think of the right word, but like different things that you can pick and choose from in here to use in your game. Now, while Star Probe was really about like the exploration, finding new planets, accumulating data about those planets for your victory condition, this is really more about like the cultures or the societies, that kind of thing. And that's what we're going to find in here. So this one also starts to present a setting. There is no setting specific to Star Probe, but this one has one. So there's going to be some historical background. They're going to, present the hostility matrix, turn sequencing. They're going to discuss the economic value of solar systems, which is one of the victory conditions that you're going to want to have in this particular game, is how much your system that you control is worth. There's tariff revenue per budget period. There's administrative data establishing the home system value. There's non-player systems, so very reminiscent of, like, say, non-player characters, or just the term. Okay, just the term of that. Contact between player empires, and then what happens. Additional sources of income, teams, output of minerals and food produce, supply, space forces, military personnel, unit organizations, map symbols, space combat, ground combat, research and development. Okay, so again, I'm not going to go through this in complete detail. If that is something that you want in the future, if you want just one video, a single video dedicated to this, this is really, I don't want to say crunchy. That sounds negative, but it's very detailed. And, quite frankly, I've not played it. And as we all know, the best way to learn how to play a game is by having someone who already knows how to play to teach you. But, if you want something, if this detail, this game is something that you're interested in, I can, leave it in the comments, and I can always think about, making a future video. But intelligence operations and other options, social and historical events, and a flowchart, optional unit design, and replacement part information. So then it gets into this historical background. It goes all the way back to the year 10,034 BC, and then it says all time frames are Terran due to its wide acceptance. But it talks about the foundation of this different empire, Multiverse. I don't know if that's how they said it. That's what it looks like to me. Empire reaching its peak with a total control of 15,321 solar systems. So it continues to go through, and there's a Terran Confederacy. There's a 19-month war. It keeps going on, and then you're getting into the future, and it gets to the future very fast. You see it goes from 10,000 BC to 2400 BC to 933 BC to 521 BC. And then it skips all the way from 521 BC to 2351 AD. So it skips over the entirety of the modern period of when this game would have even been written. And then it goes way into the future here, 9,932. So that's giving you the context for this world, essentially universe, I guess is probably a better term, to set your games in. And that's not something that we saw in Star Probe. And then it talks about if you don't have a copy of Star Probe, the following should be used for the 5-year exploration phase. So it goes over that. So this is it's a few things. It's a sequel to Star Probe. It is technically also a standalone game, but it does best if you have played through Star Probe, because one of the ways that you can play Star Empires is having played Star Probe first, made decisions, and then the outcomes of those decisions that you make in Star Probe would then affect how you play Star Empires. It's not required to play that way. Again, you could play this separately as a standalone game, but it really benefits from having played through Star Probe first. Okay, and then you just, we're going to see, like, here's our, your hostility matrix, and it's, the same list of species that we saw in Star Probe. Okay, so it's going to just keep, there's more and more in here. So there's a few things I want to discuss in this. And again, I'm not intending to go through this in detail because it's like I said, it's very, very detailed. Fun little weapon chart here with all your different kind of missiles. Your weight factors for ships and forts weapon systems. So this is the kind of detail, so this is a style of game that it's starting to presage a lot of things that might affect games in the future and not just role-playing games. So I am not a big video gamer, but I understand from reading from people who have played this and who are big video game players. They noted that there's a lot of things in this that they saw sort of like play out in future video games. And again, I'm not a video gamer, so I can't speak to the truth of that. But also just it's sort of this turning point of what's happening with games, at TSR specifically, but also just in general. 1977, we're going to start seeing this huge proliferation of more and more games that are, I'd say, less like this and more in the vein of either like D&D or a stripped down version of this that is with the intent of making it much more approachable to someone who's not necessarily having a war game background. And so this is sort of at that sort of cross point, I would say, when you look at the history of the kind of games that are going to come out after this. All right, so some interesting things, though, with this game. Designed by John Snyder, we already talked about how he's part of that Blackmore bunch. He's a player in Blackmore. He was involved in Blackmore. He ran some Blackmore games that we found out later on. And we already talked about the introduction to Star Probe, where he had a connection to Blackmore when he was playing Star Probe. And we talked about how Dave McGarry played Star Probe with John Snyder and Star Empires. Like, sort of his approach to the game was that role-playing approach. So again, while this isn't marketed as a role-playing game, and by this time TSR is already using the term role-playing game because we saw that on Metamorphosis Alpha in 1976, they don't market it this way. But the original players who played this, to them, that this was role-playing. This was role-playing. So once you know that and you understand how the original people played, even though there's all these really detailed rules for like moving around the map and taking over territories and that kind of stuff, as far as the players themselves, how they approached it, it was these ongoing campaigns where they controlled a, quote unquote character. They had a role in the game that they assumed. And then those decisions of how that character would react in certain situations affected how the game moved forward. So that's very much a role-playing exercise. Okay, but there was a third part of this game, or this trilogy, that was going to be called Star Master. And my understanding is the draft of that game was written. So I got a lot of this information from two places. I got it from Wayne's books. Wayne is a seller of out-of-print, old-school gaming materials. So I'm going to put a link below to his shop. And then also I got it from the folks at Fellowship of the Thing, who are behind, the Secrets of Blackmore. Again, sort of like they're... I don't know that they're necessarily like the sole provider of information on the Blackmore bunch, but they have just a ton of information. And so they talked about that there is this third part of this trilogy, Star Master, that was written and TSR never published it. And so there's a lot of suppositions behind why that happened. Like, why did TSR not publish the third part of this? And one guess is that because John Snyder was so associated with the Blackmore bunch, and by this point in time, TSR was kind of like pushing those folks away. Dave Arneson was already gone, and they were kind of doing things their own way, the Lake Geneva way, not in the way of the Blackmore group. And so maybe there was this feeling that like they didn't want to publish John Snyder's game because they wanted to get rid of the last vestiges of the Blackmore bunch. So again, that's not my theory. Those are theories that I've read from the folks at, again, Secrets of Blackmore and some other places online. And I think there could be something to that. It could make sense. I don't think it's necessarily documented anywhere that was the the decision that was made. I think it's suppositions being made on what happened. So the other thing that people say is that, well, TSR by this point has realized that Dungeons and Dragons is really their bread and butter. And so they want to publish more games like that. And, we do see that. We've got Metamorphosis Alpha, then you have Gamma World, then you have a second revised edition of Boot Hill in 79. And then you've got Gangbusters and Dawn Patrol, which was originally more of like a war game. And they transition it and call it a role-playing game. I showed that before. And so, they've got all these things where they're pushing role-playing game. And maybe to them, this just didn't quite fit. Again, I don't know. These are guesses that people make. And then Star Frontiers comes out. So it does seem kind of odd that there was a huge gap between 77 when this comes out and then 82 when Star Frontiers comes out, where TSR does not have a true science fiction role-playing game, despite the fact that after fantasy, it's probably the next biggest category looking for sort of a game. And I think because of that, that's why Traveller ends up sort of capturing that market. And even though they didn't probably have the distribution, the marketing dollars, TSR was on the upswing at this point. And I think had they made the jump into science fiction, things could have turned out a lot different, but they didn't. And they allowed Traveller to grab a foothold into that market and didn't really ever kind of come out of that. So when people talk about science fiction role-playing games, Traveller's usually the first one that comes to mind. It's not Star Frontiers. Okay, so some other interesting things in this, though, that sort of point to what TSR was thinking. So there's this flowchart here. There's a few of these in the book. So again, this is Star Empire 77, and there are these flowcharts. I want to look at this one here. I have to turn the book upside down. This is the research flowchart 1, difficulty 1, in terms of figuring out, how things work. Okay. Now, remember this. I'm going to try to hold it open. This is Gamma World, 1978, published by TSR, written by James Ward. And we have a diagram in here for figuring out how to use technology that you've never encountered before. It's identical. It's totally identical. So it's very interesting. I guess interesting is a good word. That just gets lifted. This gets lifted and put right into Gamma World. There's no mention of John Snyder or the Blackmore Group or Star Empires. Nothing in there. This just gets picked up and put directly into this. Now, that this is something that I noticed. I mean, I kind of noticed it and I knew I'd read it before, and then I looked it up and I was like, yeah, Wayne's books talked about this, which is why it was familiar to me. So I don't know if he caught it first or if it was well known, but he did mention it, and that's where I saw it first. But I think most people don't think that James Ward necessarily just copied this without, I think the understanding is that had James known that that's what he was doing, he wouldn't have done it that way. I think probably he got handed something like that or whatever it was. Most people don't want to blame James Ward for just directly, plagiarizing is too strong a word, maybe, or maybe it's the right word, but copying this flowchart. But whatever the thing is, there's elements of this game that then influence this, which then influenced this game in the future, right? That came from this book or this game that they really were no longer acknowledging. Okay. Now, another thing that happens that I've read, and again, I have not read the draft version of Star Master, which was the third part of this trilogy. But the folks behind Secrets of Blackmore they apparently have a copy of that draft that was submitted to TSR and never returned. Or if they don't have that copy, they do have, I guess there was a version that was written later on that was intended to be published by the company that Dave Arneson founded after he left TSR, Adventure Gaming. And he was going to publish Star Master the way that they intended. And I think that what I understand is that a draft of the game was written to be published by that, and then it still wasn't published, but at least, the draft exists. And so the reason I bring this up is that the folks behind Secrets of Blackmore say one of the interesting things that you see in the draft of Star Master is that there are no rules for spaceships. how to build them and how to have like spaceship combat in Star Master. And there are no rules for doing that in Star Frontiers. So that's a pretty tenuous connection, but it's interesting that by this point, again, Traveler's out there. There are games out there that deal with how to have space combat. I mean, there's even some details in Star Probe, but the draft of what was intended to be this third part of this trilogy doesn't include that. It never gets published. And then a few years later, TSR published this completely different game. And it also doesn't have rules for that. And so a lot of people think that like it's because the people who wrote this game were sort of looking at the stuff that was included. Now, mechanically, again, my understanding is like as far as the game mechanics, there's nothing in there in Star Master. And even in like this, there's nothing here that has an impact in the rules for Star Frontiers and how this game is played. But as far as the content and what they were covering, that does seem kind of like coincidental that neither one of them have rules for that. So again, that might be a bit of a reach, but it's something to just consider thinking about how, there was such a long time between the publication of this and the publication of this. And it skipped over what was supposed to be the third part of this. So I think you guys kind of get that point now. But that is kind of all I really wanted to say about Star Empires. So again, if there's something in here, if you want to see like much more detail on this, definitely let me know. And I guess, like I said, I could spend an entire video just going over this. I just don't know how many people would be interested in going over the nitty gritty of the details. So I usually when I talk about games like this, you've probably noticed in my history videos, I don't necessarily get into the nitty gritty of the mechanics. Because I'm more talking about it from an historical point, like how was it influential in the history of role-playing games and what was, for lack of a better word, what was the role that it played in role-playing games. And I like to talk about the creators and those types of people. So that's kind of what my focus is. But again, if you want details, let me know. I just want to show some more art in here. You might as well. D.C. Sutherland III. So, probably, I guess, most famous for his work for Dungeons and Dragons and Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, but it's cool to see some science fiction art from him in here. There's not a ton, as you can see. There are some cute, cool little drawings. And I think that's kind of cool. I'm trying to get that full picture in there. Okay, so same thing with Star Frontiers. If you want a dedicated video just to Star Frontiers and its legacy and influence in role-playing games, leave me a note. I mean, I was kind of intending to do it, and actually I was intending to do a video about Star Frontiers first. That was on my list because I've already covered Gamma World. I've covered Empire of the Petal Throne. I've covered a little bit of Boot Hill in that video, my 1975 games video, Marvel Superheroes, Top Secret. So Star Frontiers was like the last main one of TSR that I played back in the day, and I was going to cover it. And then I ended up going to DaveCon and meeting, all the folks there, and then learning more about Star Probe and Star Empires. And I kind of thought, it would be interesting to kind of just combine them together and put them into one video. So that's where I landed on that. But again, if you want to see more on this and great Larry Elmore cover art here, and talk a little bit about it. It's very interesting. There's like species in here that kind of look like they could have been inspired by species in here. But then again, it's like, there's like amoeboid kind of species in here that are like shapeshifters, and there's some in here too. But that is sort of a science fiction trope. So it's like, is it really inspired by this, or are they inspired by the source fiction? I can't answer that. It is, at the end of the day, it's kind of influential or coincidental, I guess. Was the word I was looking for. But like I said, I can go over this in a future video. And let me know in the comments what you think about that and if you would want me to do that. And then, of course, while you're down there, I would really appreciate it if you could check out where you can find me on social media, where, I'm on, Facebook, Twitter, all that kind of stuff. You can find links to my blog where I post content from time to time. And I've already kind of talked about, so I'm flipping my page here for my notes. I did want to thank really quickly all of my super fans who have contributed to the channel, just to say thank you for me making these videos. It really does take a long time to make these videos. I have to carve out a significant number of hours out of my week to put it together, gather all the materials, make my notes, do research, record, edit. And so there's people that are thanking me as a super thanks, and I really, really appreciate them. And also just wanted to say, be on the lookout. I think I am going to start a Patreon at a certain point. I already kind of know what I want to offer folks. I just need to find time to do it. So that's another thing to be on the lookout for in the horizon. So I would appreciate that and your support there if when I get around to doing that. And that's going to wrap it up for this video. So thank you so very much for watching. Stay safe. Happy gaming, and I will talk to you next time. And now for the bonus content, what I was drinking, what I was listening to when I made my notes for this particular video. So today's July 1st, just kind of wanted to mix things up a little bit. And I'm drinking this. This is Bitters and Soda, grapefruit flavored, made with hella bitters. No sugar added, and it is naturally flavored, so it's kind of cool. If you look at the ingredients, there's nothing really crazy. The bitters themselves have allspice, black peppercorns, caraway, cinnamon, clove, etc. And it does have carbonated water and then some grapefruit juice. So, obviously it's non-alcoholic, which is kind of cool. It's a hot summer day here in where I live in Southern California. So this was kind of more refreshing. I was working on my notes this morning earlier, recording in the afternoon. But so these guys make a bunch of different types of these types of drinks, bitters and soda. So they have a recipe on here that you can use this to make a paloma. They call it a bitter paloma. And then they have the Na-Loma, N-A-Loma, which is the non-alcohol version. Now, quite honestly, a paloma is so easy to make. I wouldn't use a can like this for that. But I'm not opposed to like mixing alcohol with canned beverages like this. I just sort of feel like sometimes they're easy enough to just kind of do on your own. I would prefer to just use fresh grapefruit juice in a paloma. Grapefruit mixes really well with mezcal, really anything smoky, but mezcal is a good accompaniment. So a mezcal paloma is a perfectly great drink, very sippable and easy to drink in summer, like if you're sitting out by the pool or anything. But anyway, cheers. Thanks again for watching through the bonus content. Yeah, it's very refreshing. So as far as listening-wise, this is really fun. This is Just Say 50. It's a box set, and it is the SIRE Records 50th anniversary box. So I got this, I think, if I remember correctly, it was part of Record Store Day a few years ago. So I'm just going to, we can look at the back here to see what's on here. But you see, it starts out with, some songs that maybe you might not be familiar with, but by the time you get to the bottom of side one, the second, you're the back half, Flaming Groovies, you have Blitzkrieg Bop by the Ramones. You've got stuff here by The Talking Heads, Psycho Killer. You have Ça Plombe pour moi by Plastic Bertrand. You would recognize that song if you ever watched European Vacation, which I watched like 1,000 times when I was a kid. Pop music. Madness, One Step Beyond, Brass and Pocket Pretenders, Rescue, Echo and the Bunnymen. This is like right in my zone of like when I was starting to kind of discover music for myself as opposed to what my parents listened to. I also played piano for a number of years, so I was really kind of well steeped for a while in like classical because that's all my teacher would teach. And when we moved to Southern California, there's a radio station here in Los Angeles area called K-Rock. And at the time, they were extremely kind of like on the cutting edge of discovering these new bands that were coming out of like, CBGB in New York and England and things like that like other stations wouldn't play. Now they've gone like way more corporate and they're, doing a lot of pop and stuff. Back in the day, they were really cutting edge. So this is the kind of music that you would hear on that station. And I, like many people my age, in the 80s, music was how we sort of identified our tribe. If you saw someone wearing a t-shirt or heard them listening to a song that you liked, you kind of be able to start a conversation with them. And that was something I did often. But Tainted Love and Mirror the Bathroom, English Beat, love English Beat. I know one of my followers on Twitter, and he also makes D&D content, like old school D&D content. He lives here in Pasadena, and interestingly enough, he is like, I think the manager, or he's something related to English Beat, like in a management position at English Beat. Starry Night Press is the name. I'll put a link down in the show notes. He and I have chatted many times on Twitter over the years, and it's fun that he lives in my hometown. But anyway, you go through Madonna and Yaz and Depeche Mode, and then you get over here, the Smiths and the Cure. Now we're on LP3 already. Erasure, The Replacements. I love that song, Alex Chilton, one of my favorites. Firewoman by the Colts, Lou Reed, Brian Wilson, Tommy Page, Ice-T, Ministry, Dinosaur Jr. So it's 4 records just full of these like great songs of kind of like this classic era of SIRE records. So I was having fun listening to it. I mean, it is a little hard to do notes when I'm listening to something like this because I end up getting sucked into the music where I kind of stop doing my notes and I kind of start just like, I realize that like I've just been sitting there kind of like listening to the music and bopping along. But anyway, I should have looked this up. I have no idea how expensive this box set is on the secondary market, but you could build a playlist very easily, just grabbing these songs and pulling them into whatever streaming service you use or whatever, and that would be a good way to kind of explore a history of this very influential label throughout time and kind of listen to maybe some of the songs aren't really your jam, but it's kind of cool to still listen to them anyway in the context of the order and of how they came out and at what period of time they were influential. So anyway, that is Just Say 50 SIRE Records, the history of SIRE Records 50th anniversary. So thanks again so much for staying through the bonus content. Thanks for watching the video. I hope you enjoyed it, learned a little something new. Maybe a lot of people don't talk about those games very much, Star Probe, Star Empires. So I thought you would enjoy that. And in the meantime, if you could please check out some of these other videos here, even if you've already watched it and it's been a while, if you don't mind, if it's something that you might want to revisit, I would really appreciate it. It definitely helps out the channel when people stick through to the end and then they click through to watch another video. So thanks again so much. Cheers. And I will talk to you next time.